Good day. Today I'll discuss to you objective formulation. So let me share to you my screen. So this will be our topic for today, formulating the research objectives. And these are the learning objectives for today, that at the end, you will be able to define what an objective is, understand the rationale of the research objectives, know the different uses of research objectives, differentiate a general objective from a specific objective, write good specific research objectives, and identify the flaws, misconceptions in writing the research objectives. You see, one of the parts of the research where people commit a lot of mistakes is in the formulation of objectives. And so we will give more emphasis in this lecture on the different flaws, misconceptions in writing the research objectives. So let's begin with a definition of what an objective is, or objectives. So the research objectives are what the researcher wants to achieve in the study. This is actually the direction that the researcher wants to take in the study. They provide the direction, as I said, of the study, and they define in specific and concise terms what the researcher really wants to realize. Research objectives will lead the researcher, the investigator, to this particular topic, to this particular issue that he wants to make. And then the rationale for the research objectives. When you formulate the research objectives, you formulate it following a problem identification, meaning from the problem that you have identified, and we told you that research begins with a problem. From the problem that you have identified, you either make a research question. We told you that the research question is supposed to answer the research objective, the research problem, I should say. And then from the research question that you formulate, formulate your research objectives. Or you can go directly with formulation of the research problem from the of the research objective from the research problem that you have identified. And the research objective is formulated to address the problem that the researcher has identified. Really, so you want to address that problem. This statement seems to be logical, seems to be easy to understand, seems to be what really researchers would want to do, except that a lot of people don't seem to really realize this point. Later on, when we go, when we talk about, when you go to the second year, and then we talk of writing the introduction, and then when you actually make your proposal, you will be trying to look into the research problem and the research objectives that we will explain to you. From the formulation of the research objectives, all other parts of the protocol or the proposal will follow. So that really one of the most important things, if not the most important part of the research, is the research objective, because everything will follow from the research objectives. We will enumerate what are those things. It is therefore very important that the research objectives be formulated clearly and specifically. Okay, So these are the uses of the research objectives. As we said, from the research objective, everything will follow. So from the research objectives, one will be able to know what variables you need to define. Later on, when you start making a proposal, you will have to define the variables. And it is actually from the research objectives that you identify the variables to be defined. We will have a lecture on operational definition, and we will also mention this again. Then how the sample size will be calculated. When you calculate for your sample size, you will have to go back to your research objectives. And then we will have a separate lecture to you on sample size calculation. And again, I will mention to you that the sample size is calculated based on the research objectives. What statistical test will be used in the analysis? Again, the research objectives should tell us what statistical analysis to use so that the research objective will be answered and how dummy tables will be presented. So all of this, the variables to be defined, the sample size to be calculated, the statistical test, and then the dummy tables. Now, all of this will have to go back to the research objectives, even as a matter of fact, where I didn't write it here, the research design, the data collection, how you will collect the data, all of them to be able to understand the research, to be able, we need to go back to the research objectives to be able to understand all of these things that I mentioned. Now, you already know this, the most common classification of research objectives, the general and the specific objectives, except that still, I don't know why this is a very common classification, and yet a lot of people seem to be confused with the difference between the general and the specific objectives. Now, let's talk first of what the general objective is. The general objective is a statement of what the researcher expects to achieve, well, in general terms. That is why it is called a general objective, because it is expressed in general terms. Necessarily, it is not measurable. Necessarily, the general objective is not measurable. Now, we can look at the general objective as a summary of the specific objectives. And therefore, because the general objective is a summary of the specific objectives, we can look at the general objective and the specific objectives talking of the same thing. Let me repeat that. The general objective and the specific objectives should be talking of the same things, of the same thing, except that the specific objective is a specific formulation of the general objective. So the specific objectives are specific formulations of the general objective. And the reason why I'm emphasizing this to you is that I do see a lot of people coming to me for consultation, giving to me a general objective, showing to me a general objective that's different from the specific objective. So they phrase this as a general objective and then phrase specific objectives different from the general objective. They think that the general objective is the main objective, or some people look at it as the primary objective, and the specific objectives are secondary objectives. Specific objectives are secondary objectives, different from the general objective. No, as I said, the general objective can be seen as a summary of the specific objectives. And as I said, the general objective, because it is a summary, is not measurable. And for you to measure, because it is not measurable, how do we now measure the general objective if it is not measurable? we need to formulate specific objectives. And this brings us to the topic on specific objectives. These are statements that the researcher expects to achieve now in specific terms. A while ago, the general objective is a statement in general terms. That is why it's called general objective. Isn't that obvious? And this specific objective is a statement of what the researcher expects to achieve now, obviously in specific terms. That is why it is called a specific objective. And they are specific formulations of the general objective. And suffice it to say that they form, the specific objectives form specifically the general objective. They are formulated to measure the general objective. So you have a general objective, or let us put it this way, we can begin formulating the specific objectives. And if we do have many specific objectives, then we will summarize the many specific objectives as one general into one general objective. Because as I said, the general objective is a summary of the specific objectives. Needless to say that if we only have one specific objective, there is nothing to summarize. There is nothing to summarize because there's only one specific objective. We don't need to summarize it. And therefore, you don't need the general objective. And therefore, you don't need a general objective. Later on, I will talk about this one specific objective towards the end. Now, let me go to the common mistakes in objective formulation. Right? A lot of people make mistake in the objective formulation. And the reason why I would like to emphasize this to you now is so you won't commit the same mistake. Okay, the researcher makes a plan of activity. You see, we need to distinguish between a program objective from a research objective. A program objective develops, or this is an example, this is an example of a program objective to develop a model that will predict severity of dengue. Development of a model is a program objective. Okay, the program objective is something that we do as a task to achieve something, meaning we do as a program, we do as an activity. It's a plan of activity. A research objective is something that we determine by way of data collection. Let me repeat that. A research objective is something that we determine by way of data collection, So when you say to develop a model, you are developing a model. That's a program objective. To conduct a research that will help solve the problem related to compliance to treatment of diabetic patients. To conduct a research, well, that's a program objective. Or to educate the community in the importance of following health protocols to stop COVID-19 transmission. So to educate is a program objective. That is not a research objective. So a program objective, as I said, is a plan of activity. A research objective determines an event by way of data collection. So please don't confuse a program objective from a research objective. Objectives specify procedures, not outcome. To conduct a survey among medical practitioners, don't say that. That's a procedure. To gather data on the practices of doctors in the rural community in the management of COVID-19. Gather data is a procedure, not an objective. So don't say that. Objectives include determination of demographic profile of the study participants. I would like to think that this is one of the most common mistakes people make. And almost 80% of people coming to me for research consultation, they talk of determination of the demographic profile as an objective. I told you a while ago that the research objective is supposed to direct you what you want to achieve in the paper, what you want to achieve with your research. Demographic profile is not. I mean, demographic profile is not part of it. So when you say, for example, to determine the demographic profile of patients with Alzheimer's disease, you don't write that as an objective. To determine the demographic characteristics of caregivers taking care of elderly patients in terms of age, sex, civil status, educational attainment. This should not be part of the specific objectives because that really is not your objective. That really is not your objective because that is not the problem that you have identified. As a matter of fact, we cannot put an objective where when I did not put that in the problem that I have identified, when you start writing, as I said a while ago, when you start writing your introduction, you will have to put there the problem that you have identified. And then that is the problem that you want to solve. That is the problem that you want to address. And therefore, that will be the objective of my study will try to address the problem that I have identified. And determination of the demographic profile is not part of that. It's not part of that. Remember, when you write your specific objectives, you will have to go back to your introduction. The objective should have been rationalized in your introduction. Let me repeat that. The objectives that you write should have been rationalized in your problem identification in your introduction. As a matter of fact, well, we can write determining the demographic profile of patients as an objective if, and only if, my objective is to determine the demographic profile. I mean, I make a paper to determine the demographic profile. That really is my objective. So for example, let me just give you an example. The first time that COVID-19 was discovered, and that was early in 2020, early in 2020, okay, early months of 2020, okay, people would want to know the demographic profile of people who develop COVID-19. So you can make that as an objective because specifically, you don't know who are the people affected by this COVID-19. You might want to know their demographic characteristics. So you can make that as an objective because that precisely is the objective of your study, to determine the demographic profile. But if that is not the objective of your study, so for example, in this particular example, to determine the demographic profile of patients with Alzheimer's disease, okay, the objective, the title of this paper is Factors Affecting Alzheimer's Disease. Factors affecting, what are the factors that affect Alzheimer's disease? And you don't talk of demographic profile. We don't talk of demographic profile as an objective, even if the demographic profile is a factor in the Alzheimer's disease. You go specifically to that objective to determine the factors affecting Alzheimer's disease in terms of, and if you are talking of demographic profiles, in terms of age, sex, educational attainment, etc. So that is a proper way of formulating your research objective. You don't try to determine the demographic profile because that is not the objective of your study. So please, when you go to the second year, when you start writing your research protocol, I don't want you to be talking of demographic profile, except that really is your objective. Objectives are too broad. Objectives are too broad to describe the benefits of a rehabilitation program, to provide a description of rapid opioid dose titration among cancer patients with moderate to severe pain. So very, very broad. You need to be specific, as I said. Well, objective should always be specific. Objective should always be specific. Objectives specify analysis to be done. This is, again, one of the more common mistakes. People specify the analysis to be done. The analysis to be done should be specified in the later on in the statistical analysis, in the methodology, to calculate the odds ratio in the relationship between BMI and severity of dengue using logistic regression. Don't put this as an objective. Put the calculation of the odds ratio using logistic regression under statistical test, not as an objective. Objectives include comparison of characteristics of treatment groups and experimental study. Students are not, rarely do students commit this mistake. I don't know if you understand what this means. You see, just an example, to compare the demographic characteristics of pediatric patients with mild persistent asthma given Montelukast versus those given inhaled corticosteroid. You see, in a clinical trial, later on we'll be talking, I'm not sure if you are familiar with clinical trials, some of you may be. In a clinical trial, we look into the effectiveness or efficacy of a particular treatment modality or a treatment. For example, now, molnupiravir versus the standard treatment So if you want to look into the efficacy of these two drugs, molnupiravir versus standard treatment, okay, characteristics of these two groups. So we have two groups of people, one group taking molnupiravir plus standard treatment, and another group taking standard treatment alone without molnupiravir. The characteristics of these two groups should be similar. The characteristics of these two groups should be similar, so that the only difference in their characteristics is one is given the molnupiravir, one group is given molnupiravir, the other group is not. That's the only difference. So that should there be a difference in the outcome, what you want to determine, then we attribute the difference to the drug, to the treatment. Because the only difference is the treatment. Because if the characteristics are not comparable, meaning there is a difference in the characteristics between the two groups of people, should there be a difference in the outcome, we can't attribute the difference to the drug. For all we know, the reason why there is a difference in the outcome is that because of the difference in the characteristics. And that's the reason why some people write this as an objective to include, they include comparison of the characteristics. As an example, to compare the demographic characteristics of pediatric patients with mild persistent asthma given Montelukast versus those given inhaled corticosteroid. But remember, class, Comparison of the characteristics of the treatment group is part of statistical analysis. You don't write that as an objective. That's part of statistical analysis. We need to make a comparison, but that is not the objective of the study. The objective really of the study is to determine the effectiveness of Montelukast, or to compare the effectiveness of Montelukast against or versus inhaled corticosteroid among patients with mild persistent asthma. So that actually is the objective. Comparison of the demographic characteristics is part of statistical analysis. Objectives include analysis of confounders. Some people will talk of confounders to determine the relationship between noise and cardiovascular disease, controlling for the effects of age, sex, comorbidity, lifestyle, and family history. You see, control of confounders is again part of the statistical analysis. We need to control for confounders for us to be able to make a valid conclusion. Later on, we will be talking of confounders, but just to tell you that you don't include analysis of confounders in an objective, because again, that is part of statistical analysis. Again, part of statistical analysis. Too many objectives and redundant statements to determine if age is associated with OSA, to determine if BMI is associated with OSA. OSA is obstructive sleep apnea. To determine if neck circumference is associated with OSA, to determine if abdominal circumference is associated with OSA. You see, you can make just one specific objective for this, to determine if demographic characteristics, anthropometric measurements are associated with OSA. So in terms of age, BMI, neck circumference, or waist circumference, just make that statement as one specific objective. Objectives contain recommendations to recommend measures to promote good hospital practice in disinfection of hospital supplies and equipment. This is a common mistake among people taking up master's program or doctorate program. I do see a lot of people making this as an objective. Don't put recommendation. You don't put recommendation as part of the objective. Recommendations are part of all research, but they are not stated. They are not stated as objectives. You don't state them as an objective. Remember, the research objective is answered by way of data collection. So you answer something. You don't make a recommendation. A recommendation is part of your research that you make towards the end, after you have gotten the results, after you have analyzed the data. This is the result of my study. The result is supposed to answer the objective of the study. I make a recommendation, and therefore you don't put that as an objective. You don't put recommendation as an objective. This is not your direction. This is the recommendation. The recommendation is something, it's an offshoot of your research paper. Okay, my suggestion. The examples that I gave to you, that I mentioned to you, I failed to mention to you at the beginning, are not hypothetical examples. These are actual objectives given to me during consultation when they consult me. But of course, I didn't have to put their name. So this is my suggestion. Better that you formulate only one specific objective. Better that you formulate only one specific objective. I don't know. I would like to think that I don't know if I am the only person who is making this recommendation. Whenever I say this to people, majority would ask me, is that possible? I only have one specific objective. And then I say, that actually is my suggestion, my recommendation to you. The reason for that is in majority of research given to me during their consultation. I've been teaching research for more than 20 years now. And when people come to me for research consultation, so I read a lot of protocols. They would always write one general objective and many specific objectives. But if I read the many specific objectives that they have, they release only one specific objective. They release only one specific objectives. The first objective that they write is the demographic profile. That's not a valid research objective. And then the next objectives are procedures, again, not valid research objectives. And then other objectives are actually the same. They are talking of the same things, except that they rephrase it in another way. And I would like to believe that the reason for that is many consultants, many professors would want you to write many specific objectives, because if you only have one specific objective, they think that your paper is not good. And then they would always say, oh, why do you only have one specific objective? Where is your general objective? They will look for your general objective. Where is your general objective? Why don't you have a general objective? Why you only have one specific objective? And so students or even residents or researchers will write many specific objectives just to satisfy, the question being asked of them. Really, class, as I said a while ago, a lot of people just make one specific objective. If you just scrutinize really what the paper is all about, there is only one specific objective. So as I said, better that you write only one specific objective. If you read medical journals, and I suggest that you do, if you read many medical journals, a lot of them would only have one specific objective. A lot of them would only have one specific objective. And when you only have one specific objective, you don't have, as I said a while ago, to formulate a general objective. Because as we said, the general objective is supposed to summarize the specific objectives. So there is nothing to summarize. There is nothing to summarize. And because you only have one specific objective and you don't have a general objective, you don't have to say specific objective. You don't have to say specific objective. Just say objective of the study. But that objective has to be specific. The only reason why we have we specify specific objectives and general objective, if we do have a general objective and many specific objectives. So just to distinguish the general from the specific. But if you don't have a general objective, nothing to distinguish it from. So just say the objective of the study. I think that will be all, and hopefully we'll be able to discuss your questions in class. Okay, thank you and keep safe.